What if the very thing designed to protect you was silently counting down to your death? That question haunted soldiers long before anyone dared to say it out loud. Because when the new uniform was introduced, it wasn't just fabric and stitching. It was sold as salvation, a breakthrough, a technological leap meant to close the gap between survival and annihilation on a modern battlefield. Commanders praised it, engineers defended it, soldiers trusted it, and for a brief, dangerous moment, everyone believed the problem of vulnerability had finally been solved. The uniform arrived, wrapped in authority. Official briefings described it as lighter, stronger, smarter. Its materials were engineered to endure harsher climates, reduce fatigue, and adapt to evolving combat conditions. In training camps and forward bases, it symbolized progress, proof that lessons from past wars had been learned. This was not just clothing, it was doctrine made wearable, and that distinction mattered, because once something becomes doctrine, questioning it becomes almost unthinkable. For the soldiers issued the uniform, trust came naturally. Uniforms had always been sacred in military culture. They represented identity, discipline, belonging. When a new one arrived bearing official approval, it carried an implicit promise. Someone, somewhere, had tested this. Someone smarter, higher ranked, more informed. The soldier's job was not to doubt, it was to execute. And so they put it on without hesitation, adjusted straps and fasteners, and stepped into combat believing they were safer than the men who came before them. What no one emphasized was how quickly urgency had replaced caution. The pressure to adapt was immense. Enemy tactics were evolving faster than training manuals could be rewritten. Casualties were mounting, reports demanded solutions, and innovation became the most attractive answer. In that climate, speed mattered more than skepticism. Field trials were compressed. Edge cases were dismissed. Real combat variables, mud, heat, sweat, fear, exhaustion, were reduced to footnotes. On paper, the uniform worked perfectly. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Units deployed wearing the new gear performed as expected. Early reports were neutral or cautiously optimistic. Any anomalies were attributed to stress, terrain, or individual error. War always produces noise in the data, but beneath that noise, something subtle was taking shape. Not dramatic enough to trigger alarms, not obvious enough to demand investigation. Just small inconsistencies, moments when outcomes didn't align with training, when survival depended on luck more than skill, and that is where the danger truly lived, in familiarity. The longer the uniform was worn without open failure, the more unquestionable it became. Soldiers adapted their movements around it. Tactics adjusted unconsciously. Confidence grew the most dangerous variable of all, because confidence changes behavior. It makes you expose yourself for half a second longer. It makes you trust concealment that isn't there. It makes you assume protection where only illusion exists. What made this innovation especially lethal was not malice or incompetence, but belief. Belief that modern warfare could be solved by design alone. Belief that technology, once approved, was neutral and reliable. Belief that failure would announce itself loudly, not creep in silently through repetition. No one was looking for a fatal flaw, because everyone believed fatal flaws belonged to the past. Yet, even in these early days, the seeds were already planted. The uniform was interacting with the battlefield in ways its creators never experienced firsthand. Conditions it was never meant to face were becoming routine. And while soldiers adjusted instinctively, the system around them did not. Reports filtered upward, stripped of nuance. Patterns dissolved into statistics. Warnings lost their urgency by the time they reached anyone with authority to act. This is how disasters begin in military history, not with explosions, but with assumptions. With a quiet acceptance, with the collective agreement that something must be safe because it was meant to be. And while the uniform continued to be worn, trusted, and defended, the battlefield was already exposing its weakness. One unnoticed moment at a time. If this opening made you rethink how much trust soldiers place in what they're given, take a second to engage with this story. Understanding these hidden failures isn't just about history. It's about how decisions made far from the battlefield can determine who lives and who doesn't. Leave a comment telling me what struck you most so far. Was it the blind trust, the rushed innovation, or the silence around early warning signs? Your perspective matters here. If this kind of deep, investigative military history adds value for you, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this content deserves to be seen. And if you want more stories uncovering the moments where technology, strategy, and human costs collide, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. The decision to introduce the new uniform did not come from creativity or ambition. It came from desperation. By the time it was approved, the war environment had already shifted into something older doctrines were failing to handle. Enemy forces were moving faster, adapting quicker, and exploiting weaknesses that traditional equipment had never been designed to counter. What once worked was now getting soldiers killed, and command knew it. Casualty reports were piling up. After-action briefings painted the same picture again and again. Units were being detected too easily, engagements were lasting longer than planned, and survivability in specific environments was dropping. Commanders demanded solutions that could be deployed immediately, not in years. The pressure to act was relentless, and in war, urgency has a way of silencing doubt. This was the moment when innovation stopped being optional and became mandatory. Engineers were tasked with creating something that could answer multiple problems at once: protection, mobility, concealment. The uniform was meant to be a system, not clothing. A soldier wrapped in technology. Every thread, coating, and panel had a purpose, at least on paper. It promised adaptability across climates, reduced physical strain, and improved battlefield performance. But the environment driving this change was hostile to caution. Testing cycles that would normally take months were compressed into weeks. Field trials were selective, conducted under controlled conditions that could never fully replicate combat chaos. Soldiers in testing units followed protocols, not survival instincts. Sweat levels, fear responses, exhaustion. These variables were impossible to simulate accurately, and yet approval moved forward anyway. Here's the first critical twist. The uniform wasn't rushed because it failed tests. It was rushed because it passed the wrong ones. Lab environments validated durability. Training exercises validated mobility. Checklists were satisfied. Boxers were ticked. What no test truly captured was how the uniform behaved when soldiers crawled through mud for hours, froze overnight, sprinted under fire, or lay motionless, waiting to ambush or avoid one. At the strategic level, the logic felt sound. If the enemy was evolving, standing eschew was suicide. Leaders convinced themselves that controlled risk was better than guaranteed stagnation. In that mindset, every delay became a potential death sentence. And so, concerns raised by lower-ranking officers or technicians were reframed as resistance to progress, rather than warnings worth investigating. Another subtle but devastating factor entered the equation: Standardization. Once the uniform was approved, it wasn't just issued, it was enforced. Mixed equipment created logistical nightmares, so legacy gear was phased out quickly. Soldiers were discouraged, sometimes outright forbidden, from modifying or supplementing the new uniform. Personal adjustments that might have mitigated problems were now violations of protocol. This is where the danger deepened. Soldiers were no longer adapting to the battlefield on their own terms. They were adapting around the uniform. Tactics shifted unconsciously. Movement patterns changed. Concealment strategies evolved to match what they believed the uniform provided. The gear wasn't just protecting them, it was shaping their behavior. And behavior, once altered, becomes invisible. No one notices gradual change while it's happening. Only outcomes matter, and early outcomes didn't look catastrophic enough to stop deployment. Losses were attributed to enemy skill, terrain, or bad luck. After all, war is chaos. Some level of loss is always expected, but beneath the surface, something critical was forming, a dependency. Units began operating as if the uniform compensated for risks it was never truly designed to handle. Small exposures became acceptable. Margins shrank. Soldiers trusted that the system had their back, even when instinct told them otherwise. That trust was reinforced by command messaging, by doctrine updates, by the simple fact that everyone else was wearing it too. Here's the second major turn. Once enough soldiers were equipped with the uniform, admitting a flaw became strategically dangerous. Pulling it back would mean acknowledging that the solution to mounting casualties might have caused new ones. It would mean retraining, reissuing, rethinking, all while the enemy continued advancing. In wartime logic, that kind of admission feels worse than silence. So the context that demanded innovation also protected it from scrutiny. Urgency justified shortcuts. Success on paper justified confidence. And confidence justified ignoring the quiet signals that something wasn't right. The battlefield, however, doesn't care about justifications. It only responds to reality. The first warnings did not arrive as alarms. They arrived as stories, fragmented, inconsistent, easy to dismiss. A patrol that was spotted faster than expected, an ambush that felt too precise, a soldier hit in a position that should have offered concealment. None of it was dramatic enough to trigger investigations. War produces anomalies every day, and commanders are trained to filter noise from meaning. These reports sounded like noise. In the field, soldiers began noticing small contradictions between what they were taught and what they experienced. The uniform was supposed to enhance concealment, yet certain movements seemed to draw attention rather than avoid it. In static positions, men felt exposed in ways they couldn't explain. Some described a strange sense of being outlined against the environment, even when perfectly still. Others mentioned that enemy fire seemed unusually accurate during moments that should have favored surprise. These observations rarely made it into official reports. Soldiers are conditioned to blame themselves first. Maybe I moved wrong. Maybe I stayed too long. Maybe the enemy just got lucky. Self-doubt is safer than questioning issued equipment. And when doubts were raised, they were often reframed by superiors as stressed reactions or inexperience. The uniform was new. Soldiers just needed time to adapt. Here's where the pattern quietly emerged. Units operating in different regions under different commands began experiencing similar incidents. Recon teams reported being detected earlier during infiltration. Snipers noticed that enemy counterfire arrived faster after the first shot. Night operations supposedly a strength of the new uniform, became strangely inconsistent. Sometimes concealment worked perfectly, other times it failed catastrophically. That inconsistency was the most dangerous part. If the uniform had failed all the time, it would have been obvious. Instead, it failed selectively, only under certain angles, certain distances, certain environmental conditions. The battlefield was effectively stress-testing the uniform in ways no laboratory ever had, and it was discovering weaknesses one casualty at a time. Some soldiers tried to compensate instinctively. They altered movement rhythms, avoided certain postures, adjusted how they used terrain. A few even attempted unauthorized modifications, adding layers, covering sections, removing elements that felt wrong. These changes were quickly discouraged. Uniform integrity mattered. Standardization mattered. Deviations were treated as discipline issues, not survival strategies. The first documented cluster of suspicious deaths occurred during operations that should have favored the issuing force. Well-planned maneuvers, experienced units, familiar terrain, and yet casualty rates spiked in moments where advantage should have existed. After action, reports struggled to explain it. Enemy skill was cited. Intelligence failures were blamed. Nobody wanted to suggest that the very equipment meant to reduce risk might be increasing it. Then came the third narrative turn, the moment when denial quietly hardened. Analysts reviewing reports noticed similarities but avoided connecting them explicitly. Patterns were acknowledged in private discussions, then softened in official language. Phrases like situational anomaly and unexpected enemy. Adaptation replaced more troubling questions. Once language changes, reality follows. Soldiers felt the shift before anyone admitted it. Trust in the uniform began to fracture at the edges, not openly, not collectively, but internally. Men hesitated longer before moving. They questioned instincts they used to rely on. Some began reverting to older habits, behaviors learned before the new equipment ever existed. But they did this quietly, carefully, aware that open criticism could be seen as insubordination. One particularly unsettling detail began circulating informally. Enemy forces seemed to react faster to certain types of movement, not gunfire movement. Crawling, repositioning, adjusting stance. Actions that should have been visually neutral were drawing attention. At first, this was chalked up to coincidence. Then it happened again and again across different units, different fronts. Same result. What made these early signs so easy to ignore was timing. Each incident on its own could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to see. Admitting it would mean confronting an uncomfortable possibility that innovation had introduced a vulnerability more dangerous than the problem it was meant to solve. By the time the first internal memos raised cautious questions, the uniform was already embedded into doctrine. Training manuals referenced it. Tactical assumptions depended on it. To pull that thread was to risk unraveling far more than fabric. It was easier to believe the enemy had simply become better. But the battlefield was no longer random. It was responding, learning, adjusting, exploiting. Something invisible to those wearing it. And while soldiers continued to operate under the assumption of protection, the margin for error was shrinking with every engagement. The flaw was never dramatic. That was its genius and its deadliness. It wasn't a tear, a malfunction, or a visible defect that could be photographed and circulated. It was a design interaction, A technical detail so small it disappeared during standard testing, yet became lethal once exposed to the full complexity of real combat. The uniform incorporated advanced materials meant to regulate temperature, reduce fatigue, and improve concealment. One layer in particular was praised for its adaptive properties. Fibers engineered to respond to environmental conditions by subtly changing texture and reflectivity. In controlled environments, it performed flawlessly. Under lab lighting, against static backgrounds, it blended beautifully. Instructors called it near invisible at distance. But combat is not static, and concealment is not just visual. It is contextual. What designers failed to fully test was how the material behaved under continuous micro-movements. Breathing, muscle tension, crawling, shifting weight, adjusting posture. In real conditions, the fabric interacted with light, heat, moisture, and motion simultaneously, and under those combined variables, it began to do something unexpected. Instead of breaking up the human silhouette, certain sections of the uniform subtly amplified it, not constantly, not universally, only under specific angles and distances, only when the soldier moved in particular ways, only when moisture levels crossed a certain threshold, or when heat differentials between body and environment created contrast. It was invisible to the naked eye of the wearer, but to trained observers, especially those already hunting for movement, it created a faint but consistent outline. This was the fatal oversight. The uniform was tested against detection tools and environments the designers expected the enemy to use. It was not tested against how a thinking opponent actually adapts. Enemy forces didn't need advanced sensors to exploit the flaw. They needed patience, pattern recognition, and experience. In field conditions, the fabric's adaptive surface sometimes reflected light differently than surrounding terrain during movement. At long distances, this was irrelevant. At very close range, it didn't matter either. But in the engagement window, where most ambushes and counter-ambushes occurred, that mid-range zone, the effect became deadly. Soldiers believed they were concealed. The enemy saw something else. Worse still, the uniform performed inconsistently. In dry conditions, it often worked as intended. In wet environments, or after prolonged exertion, its behavior changed. Sweat altered surface tension. Mud and dust adhered unevenly. Heat signatures shifted unpredictably. None of these factors appeared in standardized testing protocols because no test could replicate days of exhaustion under fire. This inconsistency delayed discovery. Some soldiers survived dozens of engagements without issue, reinforcing confidence. Others died in situations that made no tactical sense. Analysts looking for a single point of failure found none. The flaw didn't live in one component, it lived in interaction. And interaction is notoriously difficult to isolate. There was another layer to the problem: feedback, suppression. Once the uniform became standard, reports that questioned its performance were filtered through multiple levels of command. Each level softened the language. Possible correlation became inconclusive observation. Repeated detection during movement became likely enemy familiarity with terrain. The technical detail never reached the people who could reinterpret it correctly. Meanwhile, enemy forces began adjusting, without ever fully understanding why their success rate improved. They didn't need to know the science. They only needed to notice that certain movements drew fire opportunities. They slowed engagements, waited longer, watched more carefully, and when the moment came, they struck with precision that felt uncanny to those on the receiving end. This is where the fourth narrative turn locks in. The Flaw did not betray the uniform in isolation. It betrayed trust. Soldiers were trained to behave as if concealment was reliable. That belief altered tactics. Positions were held longer. Movement was delayed under the assumption of invisibility. Exposure windows expanded by seconds that no one consciously noticed. Seconds are everything in combat. By the time a handful of engineers finally questioned whether the material's adaptive properties might behave unpredictably under stress, the data was already contaminated. Too many variables, too many casualties attributed elsewhere. The uniform had passed certification. The system moved on. The moment the uniform crossed from liability to weapon was not marked by a single battle, but by a shift in enemy behavior. It happened quietly, almost respectfully, the way experienced fighters acknowledge a new reality without announcing it. Enemy units began changing how they watched the battlefield. They stopped reacting to noise first. They waited for movement. Soldiers wearing the new uniform noticed it before they understood it. Fire no longer came randomly. It arrived with intention. Shots landed closer to first movement. Suppression fire felt less speculative and more precise. In engagements where surprise should have belonged to them, they found themselves pinned down within seconds. The enemy wasn't guessing anymore. What the uniform did, without anyone realizing, was standardized visibility. By interacting with light, moisture, and motion in a predictable way, it created repeatable cues. Once those cues were noticed, they could be anticipated. The battlefield stopped being chaotic and became readable to anyone patient enough to observe long enough. Enemy forces didn't need manuals or captured documents. They learned through repetition. They noticed that soldiers moving low, slowly, and deliberately were still being detected. They noticed that repositioning after firing drew faster responses than before. They noticed that certain postures created faint but reliable contrasts against terrain. These observations became tactics. This is the fifth narrative turn. The uniform didn't just fail to hide soldiers, it taught the enemy how to find them. Once that understanding took root, engagement dynamics changed. Ambushes became counter-ambush. Defensive positions were compromised earlier in fights. Snipers reported that their concealment windows shrank dramatically. Enemy fire arrived before full target acquisition. Should have been possible. It felt personal, almost predictive. Some units began altering behavior instinctively. They froze longer. They moved less. They avoided certain movements altogether. But freezing creates its own risks. Delayed action invites encirclement. Hesitation breaks momentum, and momentum is survival. Soldiers found themselves trapped between two bad options: move and risk detection, or stay still and lose initiative. What made the situation worse was doctrine lag. Training materials still assumed the uniform provided enhanced concealment. Soldiers were told to trust it, to operate aggressively, to take calculated risks. Those calculations were now wrong, but no one had updated the math. Enemy units exploited this mismatch mercilessly. They began baiting movement, a single shot deliberately off target, just close enough to force repositioning. When the soldier moved, they fired again, accurately. In some areas, enemy forces stopped firing altogether until movement revealed positions. Silence became a weapon. This wasn't superior technology, it was superior observation. The uniform also affected coordination. Squad-level movement relies on trust that concealment applies evenly, but the Flaw didn't affect all soldiers equally. Small variations in environment, exertion, and posture meant some were exposed while others remained hidden. This fracture, leaders struggled to understand why certain team members drew fire while others didn't. It looked like bad luck. It wasn't. As this pattern repeated, casualty distributions began shifting. Deaths clustered around specific roles and movements. Flank security, forward scouts, soldiers responsible for repositioning under fire. The ones who moved first died first. The enemy had learned who to wait for. By now, the flaw was no longer theoretical. It was operational. It shaped how fights unfolded, how long they lasted, and who survived them. And yet, from a command perspective, the data still looked ambiguous. Enemy forces adapting? Of course, that's war. Increased contact, expected higher casualties in certain units. Explained by mission difficulty. What no report could easily capture was intent. The enemy wasn't just reacting, they were exploiting. They were letting the uniform do part of their work for them. Every second, a soldier trusted concealment that wasn't there. The enemy gained time, accuracy, and confidence. Confidence spreads faster than fear. Once enemy units trusted the pattern, they acted decisively. Engagements became shorter and more lethal. Survivors described the same unsettling feeling. It was as if the enemy could see through them. The truth was worse. The enemy wasn't seeing through the uniform, they were seeing it. The real turning point did not happen when soldiers realized something was wrong. It happened when the enemy realized something was right for them. That moment never appears in official timelines, never shows up in reports or archives. It exists only in behavior, in the way engagements suddenly became cleaner, shorter, more deliberate. Enemy units began changing how they positioned themselves. Observation posts stayed silent longer. Patrols slowed their tempo. Fire discipline tightened. Instead of reacting to sound or muzzle flash, they waited for confirmation through movement. Not large movement. The small, human kind. A shoulder shift. A knee adjusting in the dirt. A body repositioning. After minutes of stillness, they had learned the uniform's language. At first, the change was subtle. A fractional second delay before firing. A pause that felt intentional. Survivors described it as unsettling, as if they were being watched, assessed, and then chosen. Enemy fighters no longer rushed engagements. They stalked them. This was not superior marksmanship. It was superior patience. Once the pattern was understood, enemy forces began shaping the battlefield around it. They selected engagement zones where lighting and terrain amplified the uniform's flaw. Transitional spaces, tree lines, broken ground, edges of structures became kill zones, not because they were tactically dominant positions, but because they forced movement at exactly the wrong moments. The enemy also stopped over. Instead of pushing aggressively, they applied pressure just enough to provoke repositioning. A burst of fire, a sudden sound, a fleeting silhouette. The response was predictable. Soldiers moved, and when they did, the uniform betrayed them. This is where the sixth narrative turn locks in. The enemy didn't just discover the flaw, they built tactics around it. They began exploiting rhythm. Soldiers trained to move in coordinated intervals unknowingly created repeatable exposure windows. Enemy units timed their actions to those rhythms. They didn't need to see clearly. They needed to know when movement would happen. Once they had that, accuracy followed. Even more dangerous was how this knowledge spread. It didn't require centralized command or formal instruction. Veterans passed it down informally. Wait for them to shift. Don't fire too early. They show themselves when they think they're hidden. These lessons traveled faster than any memo. Meanwhile, soldiers wearing the uniform sensed the change but couldn't define it. Engagements felt hostile in a new way. Not chaotic, but controlled. Fire came from exactly where it hurt most. The battlefield no longer felt reactive. It felt intentional. Some units tried countermeasures without understanding the root cause. They moved faster, then slower, then not at all. None of it restored the advantage they believed they had. In fact, some adjustments made things worse, reinforcing the very patterns the enemy was exploiting. The most dangerous realization came too late for many. The enemy was no longer fighting the soldier. They were fighting the system around him. That system included doctrine, behavior, equipment, and assumptions. The uniform was just the visible thread connecting them. Once pulled, everything else unraveled. Enemy forces began choosing when to fight and when not to. They disengaged more often, conserving strength. When they did engage, it was decisive. The casualty ratios shifted quietly but consistently, not enough to trigger panic, enough to change outcomes. Commanders reviewing footage and reports noticed something disturbing. The enemy seemed to know where to look. Positions. Thoughts secure were compromised. Movement that should have gone unnoticed drew immediate response. It looked like intelligence leaks. It wasn't. It was observation. By this stage, the battlefield had become asymmetrical in a new way. One side believed concealment still existed. The other knew exactly when it didn't. That imbalance is fatal in war, and yet no one wearing the uniform could see what the enemy saw. They couldn't perceive the flaw directly. They could only experience its consequences. Deaths that felt unfair. Ambushes that felt impossible. Survivals that felt accidental. The enemy didn't need to understand the uniform's design. They only needed to trust the pattern it created. And once they did, they never gave that advantage back. The deaths that followed didn't look like mistakes. That was the most disturbing part. They didn't fit the familiar patterns of poor planning, bad intelligence, or overwhelming enemy force. These were disciplined units executing sound tactics, dying in moments that should have favored them. And when deaths stop making tactical sense, something deeper is wrong. After-action reports became increasingly difficult to explain. Patrols were compromised without visible error. Defensive positions were neutralized before contact escalated. Soldiers were hit during pauses, not advances. During moments of stillness that doctrine said were safe, officers struggled to explain how experienced men were being eliminated in scenarios that violated every rule they knew. This is where the seventh narrative turn becomes unavoidable. The battlefield began producing outcomes that contradicted training. In multiple engagements, units reported enemy fire landing precisely where soldiers had just repositioned, not where they were firing from, not where noise originated, but where bodies had shifted moments earlier. These weren't lucky shots. They were anticipatory, the kind that assumes movement before it happens. Snipers began reporting. Something even more unsettling. Counter-sniper fire was arriving faster than reaction time should allow. After a single shot, Return fire came not to the muzzle flash, but to the new position, as if the enemy already knew where the shooter would relocate. Some snipers stopped relocating entirely out of fear that movement itself was the trigger. Casualty clusters revealed a grim pattern. Soldiers responsible for initiating movement, pointmen, scouts, flank security, were dying Hachi. Disproportionate rates. These roles had always carried risk, but not like this. Not with such consistency. It was as if the enemy had learned who mattered most in a formation, and waited specifically for them to expose themselves. Morale began to erode quietly, not through panic, but through doubt. Soldiers stopped trusting their instincts. They hesitated. They questioned cover that had worked for years. In war, hesitation is contagious. One man pauses. Another follows. Momentum breaks. And wins. Momentum is gone. Initiative follows it. Some commanders suspected enemy intelligence superiority. Drones, observers, informants, anything that explained the precision. Resources were spent hunting threats that didn't exist. Surveillance increased. Security tightened. None of it changed the outcome. The deaths continued. What made these losses uniquely destructive was their psychological effect. Soldiers could accept danger. They could accept loss. What they struggled with was unpredictability. When training fails, fear replaces confidence, and fear rewrites behavior faster than any manual ever could. In a few isolated cases, veterans began connecting dots. They noticed that deaths often followed the same sequence: stillness, subtle movement, immediate fire. They noticed that when soldiers stripped away parts of the uniform, rolled sleeves, covered surfaces, disrupted the standard appearance, detection sometimes dropped. These observations were never official. They spread quietly, man to man, whispered like superstition. But superstition doesn't grow without reason. The uniform had become a silent participant in these deaths. Not the sole cause, but the catalyst that made them possible. It created predictability where unpredictability should have ruled. And predictability, once exploited, becomes lethal. Commanders reviewing casualty data noticed something else. The enemy wasn't suffering similar losses in equivalent situations. Their movement patterns were less punished. Their repositioning didn't draw the same immediate response. The asymmetry was undeniable, even if its source remained hidden. This is where institutional resistance hardened. Acknowledging the problem now would mean admitting that dozens, possibly hundreds of deaths were not the cost of war, but the cost of a decision. A decision signed, approved. That kind of admission threatens careers, reputations, and doctrine itself. So the explanation defaulted to the safer option. The enemy had simply improved, but soldiers in the field knew better. Improvement doesn't feel like this. Improvement doesn't erase the rules overnight. Improvement doesn't turn good tactics into fatal mistakes without warning. Something else was at work. Something embedded. Something war. And as long as that truth remained unspoken, the deaths would continue to look like bad luck, even as they followed the same invisible logic again and again. By the time the evidence became impossible to ignore, the problem was no longer technical, it was institutional. The battlefield had already delivered its verdict, but command was still arguing semantics. Acknowledging the flaw now meant something far more dangerous than admitting a design error. It meant admitting responsibility. At senior levels, discussions shifted away from whether something was wrong and toward how dangerous it would be to say so. The uniform had become more than equipment. It was a symbol of modernization, of progress, of competence under pressure. Retracting it would signal hesitation. Worse, it would signal that lives had been gambled on an assumption that proved false. This is where the eighth narrative turn reveals itself. The deadliest resistance came not from ignorance, but from pride. Internal reviews began using carefully neutral language. Phrases like environmental variance, enemy behavioral adaptation, and operational coincidence dominated briefings. No one denied the casualties. They denied causation because causation demanded action, and action demanded accountability. Engineers who raised concerns were asked to reframe them. Field officers who pushed back were reminded of morale and cohesion. Soldiers reporting anomalies were quietly reassigned or told to focus on execution. The system wasn't silencing dissent aggressively. It was dissolving it through bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is patient. The uniform continued to be issued. Training continued, unchanged. Doctrine remained intact. Meanwhile, casualty figures crept upward in patterns that defied official explanations. The math was clear to anyone willing to look closely, but clarity was inconvenient. Wartime institutions are built to survive pressure, not self-criticism. Behind closed doors, some commanders understood exactly what was happening. They had seen wars long enough to recognize when data stopped being random. But they also understood the consequences of being the first to speak. Careers ended over less. So instead of confrontation, they chose delay. More studies, more reviews, more time. Time the soldiers did not have. In a few rare cases, quiet workarounds emerged. Unofficial guidance, tactical suggestions, passed verbally, subtle changes in movement doctrine that were never written down. These measures save lives, but only locally, without systemic acknowledgement. They couldn't spread widely. The uniform remained untouched, its flaw intact. What might this phase especially lethal was that the enemy continued adapting while one side stood still. The longer the flaw remained unaddressed, the deeper it embedded itself into enemy tactics. What began as opportunistic exploitation hardened into doctrine on the opposing side. And here lies the cruel irony. The more the enemy exploited the flaw, the harder it became to admit its existence. Because admitting it now meant admitting that the enemy had been winning because of us. So leadership chose a safer narrative. The enemy was improving. The battlefield was changing. Losses were unfortunate but inevitable. History would sort it out later. History, however, does not intervene mit patel. Soldiers kept wearing the uniform, kept trusting it, kept dying in ways that felt senseless, and the system that should have protected them chose stability over truth. Only when the costs grew too visible to ignore, when patterns crossed thresholds, even bureaucracy shift from "is there a problem?" to "how do we survive admitting it?" The correction did not arrive as an announcement. There was no recall order, no public acknowledgement, no admission that something fundamental had gone wrong. Instead, it came disguised as an update, a quiet revision, a refinement framed as routine improvement rather than emergency response. By the time changes reached the field, many soldiers who would have benefited from them were already gone. The first modifications were subtle. Certain materials were altered. Surface treatments were adjusted. Sections of the uniform were redesigned to behave differently under movement and moisture. Official documentation described these changes as enhancements based on operational feedback. The word flaw never appeared. It couldn't. But for those who had been paying attention, the timing said everything. The changes addressed exactly the conditions under which soldiers had been dying. Mid-range engagements, transitional lighting, movement under stress. The battlefield had forced the issue, even if the institution refused to name it. Here lies the ninth narrative turn. The fix was real, but the acknowledgement was not. Distribution of the revised uniform was slow. Logistical realities, manufacturing limits, and the sheer scale of deployment meant that frontline units received updates unevenly. Some units adapted quickly. Others continued fighting with the original design, unaware that anything had changed at all. Survival became, in part, a matter of timing. Those who received the updated gear noticed the difference immediately. Detection windows shortened. Enemy fire lost its eerie precision. Engagements regained unpredictability. It wasn't perfect. No uniform ever is. But the invisible edge the enemy had relied on began to dull. And yet, no one celebrated. There were no medals for the men who identified the problem. No commendations for those who whispered warnings that saved lives locally. No official reckoning for the costs of delay. The narrative moved forward as if nothing extraordinary had happened. For many veterans, the bitterness lingered longer than the relief. They knew of friends who had died weeks before the fix arrived, men who executed doctrine perfectly and paid for a flaw they never understood. The realization came slowly and painfully. Their deaths were not inevitable. They were preventable. In post-war analyses, historians would later debate casualty spikes, tactical shifts, and enemy adaptation curves. Some would come close to the truth. Few would state it plainly. Institutions are excellent at absorbing failure without naming it. But among soldiers, the lesson became permanent. Trust equipment, but never blindly. Respect innovation, but verify it with reality. And understand that silence, not ignorance, is often the most dangerous element on the battlefield. By the time the uniform's flaw was fully neutralized, the war had already moved on. New equipment, new threats, new assumptions, but the pattern repeated itself elsewhere, in different forms, under different names. The battlefield had taught the lesson once again. The question was no longer whether innovation could fail. It was whether anyone would admit it before the cost was paid in blood. What this episode ultimately exposes is not a failure of fabric engineering or even intention, but a failure of timing between reality and authority. War does not wait for consensus. It does not pause for committees, approvals, or reputational concerns. It punishes delay instantly and without appeal. The uniform was created to solve a real problem. That matters. The threat it aimed to counter was real, evolving, and lethal. But innovation under pressure carries a hidden risk. When solutions are rushed into doctrine, they stop being questioned. And once something becomes doctrine, it gains immunity from doubt. This is the final narrative turn, and the most uncomfortable one. The same systems designed to protect soldiers are often structurally incapable of admitting when they've failed them. In this case, the battlefield identified the flaw long before the institution did. Soldiers felt it. Enemies exploited it. Casualty patterns revealed it, but acknowledgement lagged behind, restrained by hierarchy, pride, and fear of consequence. By the time correction arrived, the lesson had already been written in names that never made reports. What makes this story repeat across military history is not incompetence, but psychology. Humans trust symbols of authority. They trust approval stamps, certifications, and official language. In war, that trust becomes survival behavior. Questioning issued equipment feels like questioning the system itself. and most soldiers are trained not to do that. The enemy, however, has no such constraints. They don't care why something works, only that it does. They observe, they adapt, they exploit. And when one side refuses to interrogate its own assumptions, the other side gladly will. This is why the most dangerous innovations are not the ones that fail loudly, but the ones that fail selectively. The ones that work just often enough to build confidence. The ones that only betray you under specific conditions. The ones that turn patterns into predictability. After the war, similar stories would surface again and again. Different gear, different conflicts, same logic. A solution rushed forward, early warnings ignored, quiet adaptations made too late. History doesn't repeat itself, institutions repeat their habits. For the soldiers who lived through this, the lesson was not technical, it was existential. Never outsource judgment completely, never assume protection is absolute, and never confuse approval with truth. Because on the battlefield, truth arrives whether you're ready for it or not.